happen to like New York. I happen to like this town. I like the city air, I like to drink of it. The more I know New York, the more I think of it. I like the sight and the sound and even the stink of it. I happen to like New York.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to The Anadromist. This is Burn Power coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia, somewhere in the Caucasus Mountains, far away from probably where you live, since very few people here watch my Anadromist channel. Well, I've decided to do something interesting today. I've decided that what I would do is kind of go over some of my influences in life. Now, I'm not going to go into my human relationships, but more the kind of creative, artistic, and intellectual things that have influenced me over the years. And the reason for this is not simple. I don't want to give you a biography. I'm not trying to dig into, what happened in Burn's life. What I'd rather do is inspire you to think about your own influences. What things influence you? Now, are all those influences good? No. But many of them are something that everything makes an impression on you. And later, these things come back in all sorts of different ways. And so what I'd like to demonstrate is how these things, starting with when you're born, the period you're in, and different phases of your life, how these things affect you. And one thing I also hope to prove to you is that the influences haven't stopped. I didn't get to a point where, I finished up university or something like that, and then, I just started doing things and I wasn't so influenced as much anymore. No, I'm still being influenced by everything, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Before we get into this, just a reminder, if it's before March, I still really need help. We only have $1,145 to go to get to the $12,000 goal, plus a little bit of cleanup work after that. So please think about supporting me on my channel. There are links below to both PayPal or GoFundMe. It would really help. I would really like to stop doing this. It's just, you don't understand unless you've done one of these. It's like it goes on. And the only reason I'm going on and on and on is because I really need to get this all. I have the tickets. Everything is prepared. I will be leaving on March 6th. But I don't have all the money yet. So that's up to you. Thank you. Help me. Well, it's up to everyone. And it's up to me to keep begging. Okay, I'll stop. So let's think about my influences. We'll put these in different periods. So the first period is period 1, and this is 1955 to 1970. I was born in Seattle, Washington. I only have 1 or 2 memories from that period. We'll leave it there as part of the personal, the relationships and all of that. That's part of something else. We moved to Hawaii when I was 4 years old. And this ends up being very crucial to a lot of who I am. I realized later, it's just like, I went to primary school in Hawaii up until the age of 7 when we moved to California. And I was a minority student there. I was white. Everyone else was either Hawaiian or Japanese or Chinese, maybe some Filipinos. But basically, there's a photo of me in a group shot when I think in first grade, and I'm barefoot. But that made a big impression on me, including things like, less crucial things to my intellectual development, like eating Chinese food and various kinds of things. So when I got to America, I was like, well, why don't you guys have any good Chinese food? But more importantly, Hawaii was the place where I first started to watch movies. And my mother would often send me to the movies with someone. Sometimes she would take me to the movies. And I'm not going to get into talking about all the movies right now. I'm going to save that for another time. But those movies made a huge impression on me. The fact that one of the very first movies I ever saw was The Sky Above, The Mud Below, a French documentary film about cannibals and headhunters in New Guinea, made a huge impression on me. I mean, I can remember literally coming into the drive-in in a car, exactly what point in the movie we were in, because we had to sit and watch it again. That was the kind of thing. But also, I remember my mother taking me to see The Phantom of the Opera, because she thought I'd really like it. She thought it was the 1940s version being brought again, but it was 1962, and it was the Hammer horror version, which is much more frightening, especially the mask, which I related somehow to my mother. And so somehow horror films got baked in when I was about 6 years old. And my mother kept saying, don't watch this. It's like things parents do. Also on television in Hawaii, it was a very interesting place. I remember the first time I ever watched King Kong was on a really junky black and white screen, a small screen in Hawaii. I can remember the apartment where I was in it, my mother ironing, we had no room for anything. And I started watching these kinds of films. I also remember Japanese samurai television films. And it was just such a strange thing to me because they were actually in Japanese. And, there wasn't any subtitles. But just kind of, I would just go like, how come these guys, it was all samurai films, so they all have the top knot and stuff there. How come they're all hitting each other with swords? It didn't make any sense to me. Of course, later it would. But Hawaii was a place, I think my memory comes alive in Hawaii because it was so different from everything that I saw visually in the first 3 years of my life. So from the ages of 4 to 7, I was there. And then we moved back to this mainland, as we call it, back to the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm not getting into all the whys of that. I'm just simply saying this is where I was. These are the things that started to come in on me from around. And like I say, we are a collection of all the things that influence. Now, what's interesting is, of course, we're not talking about families. I'm not going to tell you about how I was treated in school. I'm not going to talk to you about, when I first started to notice that girls were something or whatever, because that's not what this is. What I'm talking about is what I began to notice. And among the first things that I remember noticing in California, well, one of the big things was I was still 7 years old. And it was November of 1963, and I was at Sun Valley Elementary School, and I remember them coming in with a message that the president had been shot. And, they turned on what had to be, it just was like the worst video footage imaginable. Just take that. That's what the screen was showing us of live coverage in Texas. And the reason the screen was so bad was because that was the quality of the visual recorders and televisions in the school system. They couldn't afford really good stuff, even though this was just north of San Francisco in a pretty wealthy area. But video wasn't that important to people yet. But I remember that. And then I went home and spent the whole weekend, like most Americans did, watching things like Lee Harvey Oswald get shot, endless parades of coffins and military farewells and such. And that marked me as far on a certain level. I became very interested after that point. I wouldn't say not in politics, but in what was happening. So I was very conscious by 1968 during this tumultuous year, and I was following it very closely. Again, I wasn't identifying myself in any political way. I was just noting what was happening. And that's how I've always continued on in my life. I'm more interested in noting what's happening because I realize you don't really understand what's happening while it's happening. Contrary to the Twitterati or the Exians or whatever they are now, contrary to the immediate way news media and social media and all the stuff your friends and the people you follow immediately have an opinion. Something happens, they already know why it happened. And I realized, no, that's never true. And that's when I started to understand that then, as a young child. Also, I started, well, I'll get to music in a moment. One of the things that I noticed was that, well, yeah, let me mention music, was that the music was changing. And I kind of remember, my mother says I used to walk around the house singing La Bamba by Richie Valens. And also there was a song by, I think, Jimmy, it wasn't Jimmy Dean, it was another guy, but it was like, uh-oh, uh-oh. And, as a kid, you hear these things and you just repeat them. So I was vaguely aware of the kind of 60s rock and roll, late 50s, early 60s rock and roll and such. And I remember when the Beatles came on, I think we actually watched that on Ed Sullivan. And I remember that my first impression of the Beatles was not very favorable. And in fact, I remember having a friend who would later, ironically, become a hippie, and I'm sure was totally into the second half of the Beatles' career. But he would just go like, no talent bums and stuff. I didn't have even that opinion. I just watched them and go, all these girls screaming and them singing, I want to hold your hand and stuff. Music didn't matter to me yet. I was around 10 years old when the Beatles came. 9 and then 10. But one of the things that was happening, we had moved from Hawaii to California. We were just north of San Francisco. So I remember the older world, and this is a huge effect on me as well, because I remember the world before there were hippies. And I can't tell you how much that means. It's just like many of you out there remember the world before the internet, or remember the world before smartphones. Someday you will tell your children, or you will tell people who are much younger than you about that time, just as I can tell you of the world before there were hippies, and before there was loud rock music, before there was heavy metal, before there was punk, before there was sex, drugs, and rock and roll in the sense that we would later come to understand it. So I first started seeing these people with longer hair in my environment on the streets now and then. And I remember people said, that's a hippie. I remember we had an argument in 1967, not an argument, a discussion with my friend, and he pointed to a picture of a hippie. And when I look back now, I laugh when I realize that the group he was pointing to was anything but hippies. They were just some kind of pop band from Los Angeles. Whereas we were seeing the real things outside of our door. And I remember listening particularly to, I started listening, somehow it crept into the environment, and maybe it was through my friend David Barnes, but we started listening to KFRC, which was the local AM radio station. Later, we also added KYA, and then on the FM dial, KMPX, which turns out to have been an amazingly bizarre station. And I started listening to those charts. Once a week, they'd have the Big 30 or something like that. And so I was starting to buy these little 45 singles, and I bought a few albums as well. Now here's the thing, I'm not going to go off onto a big history of my music collecting, because it's a big history. But I will say this, from 1967, or early 1967, probably late 1966, when I first started listening to music, all the way up until 1970, when I became a Christian, my musical tastes were rapidly changing, and eventually I was listening to blues, country music, classical music. I remember going to the library and listening to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the Leopold Stokowski version that was on London Phase 4. That's how specific my memory was of these things. I remember this music so much. In fact, the KFRC charts exist online. I went and downloaded a whole bunch of them and then started making playlists for myself on the computer. And what I did is only looked at the chart and only picked out the songs I remembered. It's amazing how many. And then occasionally I would say, oh, there's a song, Back on the Street Again. And immediately, now I haven't, literally, song has never showed up on classic rock stations. And I remembered the song having probably last heard it in 1967 because it was never played after that period. And what a great song, Back on the Street Again. And so, yeah, this period is super crucial to me. And why? That gets into the psychological details that I'm not going to do. But anyway, then during this period, I was also becoming more and more aware of hippies. Students in my junior high school, we didn't call them middle schools then, and then in my first year of high school in 1969, there were more and more kids, shall we say, identifying as hippies. That's how we would talk about it now. The actual phrase was becoming hippies. And I looked at myself. One of the other things that was happening then was I was influenced, I think it was by teachers, bringing in these folk revival records into school. So I knew things like Peter, Paul and Mary and the Limelighters and the Kingston Trio, the most commercial end of the folk music. But eventually I got into Bob Dylan, and I knew who so many of the folk musicians were. But what I noticed is that the hippies all did too. So I was influenced by the same things they were, and so I listened to all the music coming out of San Francisco. Anyway, I could go on and on and on about the music. Let's continue. The free speech movement happening in Berkeley started in 1964. I didn't notice it immediately. But by 1969, when people were coming from a People's Park protest in Berkeley straight over to the San Rafael High School campus, oh yeah, I knew a lot about what was going on in Berkeley. So I have that memory, and I didn't understand the issues at all, and nor did I try to. But I was aware that something was happening there, and San Rafael High School itself was a very interesting place at a very interesting time. And the years I was there, evidently that was when somebody invented the 420 marijuana code or whatever. I have no recollection of that. I don't care. It's like whatever. But anyway, it was a very interesting time. This is also when, it was during this period my first aesthetic experiences started. So I did buy comic books, and there's a whole story there. And then I started going to buy these, the hit records and stuff that I liked, the local stuff. It was all local then. There wasn't the same radio station all across the country, which is something I think we really miss now. Now, now it's completely crazy with Spotify and stuff like that. But I would go into a record store, and they would have these fantastic posters, psychedelic posters. And it was through that I saw, essentially was introduced, without knowing it, to the Symbolist movement, to Art Nouveau, to Surrealism, and all of these things, because they were clear in the posters. Maybe I'll show a couple here, but and I'm not showing a lot of visuals on this because I would be here all day making this, and that's not my point. My point is not to show you a bunch of images. My point is to say what influences us. Also during this time I took road trips with my mother into the West, got as far as Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, from California out to these places. Sometimes we would take a friend, but just the road trip. And also I learned a lot about, just naturally growing up in that area, about the gold rush and about cowboys and Indians and all of this stuff. Eventually I would read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee about the plight of the Native Americans. And by 1970, I was feeling the failure of rock music. And it seemed like, where you once had more challenging music, suddenly you were left with the Carpenters and the Jackson 5 and the Osmonds and stuff, and all of this. I just was like, what is this music replacing the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Procol Harum and Jimi Hendrix and all of this? How could we go from that to this? I now know exactly the reason why, and it's a big story. But it is seeing that difference that created a huge part of who I am. It's noticing that times change and not always for the better. Okay, period 2, 1970 to 1978. And I was still in San Rafael at this time, but just north of San Francisco, further north, about 20 miles north, was the small town of Petaluma. That became more important during this period as well. Now, the Jesus People had started in 1967. Of course, I didn't know that. But I noticed in 1970, when I started going to my second year of school at San Rafael High School, I would hear these people singing around the campus down there. Eventually, I would discover that they were Jesus People, and we did not have a super strict, get those Christians off the campus stuff yet. Although my own little Bible study group would later go through one of the first versions of that, and we were defended by the leftists, which I always remembered. That is to say, that people want to get these Christians, we can't have any Christianity on the school property. They had already started to have those. But I remember being defended by the guys I knew, the teachers I knew were the most left-wing. And so what did I know about what they really believed? Not that much yet. But so I ended up becoming a Christian in the Jesus movement. I'm not going into that whole story. Again, this is not biography. These are influences. And I want to spark you to think, what are the things in my life that influenced me? And in fact, go ahead and write down in the comments below the kinds of things you remember in your life that were very crucial to you at different, whenever. What kind of things really made up your, what shall we call it, circle of influence. So, here's the thing that happened. I remember one guy, Kent Philpott, who's still alive, and I'm thinking of trying to see if I can interview him for the channel, gave a lot of sermons. He had his faults, but he had a lot of common sense that I inherited from him in terms of he was a Baptist, Southern Baptist minister. He had graduated from the Golden Gate Theological Seminary, along with another guy named Bob Heimers, who would later go on to be quite controversial at times. Robert L. Heimers. You look that name up and you'll find some interesting stuff. But what was interesting about both of them is they gave me a thirst for Christian history, and by extension, all of history. So they actually taught us classes. Now, the Jesus People was a wild and woolly place. Just what I learned from the people who were essentially people who had come to San Francisco to take part in the hippie dream, who had and seen that it had already failed. By 1970, anyone who tells you the hippies are, there's hippies down the street, no, there are not. Hippies died off, and the people who still had that dream went and left. They went to places like Alaska, as I would later discover, but they went up the coast. Maybe they started communes in the 70s and such. But essentially, the actual hippie dream died off, and I've talked about this at length at other places. But so I was talking with people who had been in San Francisco in the late 1970s. I mean, talk about an education. This was straight from the horse's mouth. And so I realized, looking around at what we were doing in the early 1970s, I said, I better save this weird little Christian newspaper we have. I should take a few photos. I should write in my diary, or journal, whatever. I didn't journal at the time. I wrote. The neologisms really drive me nuts. I remember bird watching, and then suddenly it was birding. I remember, being a diarist or writing in your journal, but after a while it was journaling, and it's just, when you get older, you will have the same problems I do with other neologisms. So, but I met all sorts of interesting people. Among those interesting people was the leader of Jews for Jesus, Martin Rosen, and I would go regularly down to their headquarters in Corte Madera, California, which was not very far from San Rafael, take a bus there, and sometimes I'd hang out there, help them print up some literature. We would often get their little tracts and pass them out. They were kind of humorous but serious in a very Jewish manner. And, but I learned very quickly, Jewish people can be, just there. I mean, I realized later, being in San Rafael, California, just north of San Francisco, looking back on the last names of the people I was around, I said, oh yeah, we had a lot of Jewish folks around me. Just like in, Hawaii growing up, it was like, yeah, there were lots of Chinese and Japanese and Hawaiian people. It's like after a while, when you're with people, you just see their humanity. And so I've never, for instance, I remember being told about racism, and I never got it. People were saying, yeah, people are so racist. And I just never got it. Eventually, when I got to New York City, then I understood what racism is, because I met it, in different places. Not towards me, but, the black-white issues, the Hispanic-white issues, the Asian-white, Asian-black, Asian Hispanic, all of them. There's always a problem. But I didn't see that. I saw people more for their individual humanity, and yeah, they were from a different kind of group than I was, and so what? That was interesting to me. But, to continue, I remember going over to Berkeley quite often from 1970, 73, 74, 75, and it was still a crazy place. They used to call it the Berkeley Zoo. And the reason was because there was another Jesus People group over there called CWLF. Of course, they were kind of it sounds a leftish kind of name. It was Christian World Liberation Front. But through their newspaper, Right On, which was later changed to Radix, I learned, it pointed me at a lot of social issues from a Christian perspective, but I had already gotten those in high school. So to me, they all dovetailed together. And at that time, if you were to ask me if I was left or right, I would just go like, neither. Also during this period, I was living on Christian communes after I graduated from high school. And so I learned a lot about raising animals, about gardens, and through all of this, I was really connected. Now, at a certain point, things began to change. But before they did, let's start over. I also understood more about the larger Jesus movement, and I understood more about Christianity and the many different denominations. I learned more about the larger Jesus movement and Christianity. I learned more about the Bible. I learned more. I read the Bible twice by the time I was like 23. King James Version one time, which really changes how you understand language. Suddenly, Shakespeare was no longer at all foreign to me. You see, that's what the Bible does, is it grounds you in pretty much all of Western history, up until the postmodern age where, I mean, really, does the King James Bible, does any translation of the Bible help you on TikTok? No. So, but I also learned about church history, I learned about the charismatic movement, and I would come to learn about the dark sides of these things, including the aspects that were affecting us. I was also going through 70s California. I had a taste of college life, and I rejected it because I was already very aware of the kinds of things that many people are aware of now. It just seemed to me like I couldn't study what I really wanted to, which was more, why did things change? By say, 1975, I was deeply involved with the question of why did the world change so much in my lifetime? And everything I've done comes out of that question, which is why, what would have happened if I stayed in Hawaii? I probably wouldn't have got that question that way. Then I also learned about serious work. I did things like ditch digging, raised animals, worked in a mental institution, worked in a junkyard, worked in various bookstores, worked in an industrial laundry facility, which is you don't want to know about. I did some hotel work, and it was just so much stuff I learned just doing that kind of hard work. So later, when I got to New York City, I was really impressed by how little people who were my age wanted to work or knew how to work. That is to say, they're always trying to get out of everything. I learned through this, and also, very importantly, working with older Christian brothers, specifically, it's just like, Bern, you're being lazy. But this gets into the psychological. But that's an influence too. It was also during this period I really started discovering literature. So I started reading C.S. Lewis. I started reading G.K. Chesterton, George MacDonald. I started reading classic novels when I dropped out of the Sonoma State University. No, it was Santa Rosa Junior College. I started reading the books they actually gave me to read because it just seemed so worthless then. But then I said, okay, I'm going to read Moby Dick. I'm going to read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And it was during this period I discovered Solzhenitsyn. And also during this period, I had my first introduction to the ideas coming from Francis Schaeffer and Labrie. And that would be the prod that eventually got me to Switzerland, to Labrie. Also during this point, by 1978, we'll say 77, I started to get a renewed interest in music. I had kind of dropped it. I've had 3 music collections in my life. The one that I had from, say, the age of 12 until the age of 15, 16, which I sold, not because anyone said, oh, this is demonic music, but because it just didn't seem to be worth much, and I wanted to buy my mother a Christmas present. You know, just basically went to a used bookstore and sold all my vinyl collection for pennies. Now I look back and kick myself, especially the second music collection was of Christian rock music, and I wish I had some of those still. I have a bunch now. I have received them from people getting rid of theirs. I go, oh, okay, well, I understand what these things are. Give them to me. And then but that got too beat up by living in a Christian commune because everyone would play them and they get really wrecked. And so the third collection was the one that I now have, which is obviously Metastasized Beyond All Rhyme and Reason, which is the point where I'm trying to bring my library, which includes all the records from Alaska all the way to Tbilisi. Could I take it much farther than that? It's just insane. But you can help. Donate, give, reminder. Links below. So, it was a very important period. This is where I first started listening to punk rock, Bruce Springsteen, Bernard Herrmann's soundtracks, Ralph Vaughan Williams' classical music, and so much more. I rediscovered music. I'm not going into all the hows and whys. It's a fascinating story, but I'm not doing that. And this is also where I saw the failure of our ministry because we became cultish through the connecting to a larger institution called the shepherding movement. And we also didn't keep up with the times in the sense that the reason I got into all this other music and stuff, because I realized, things are changing again and I need to understand why. And that became important for me. It was not important for the rest of us. Meanwhile, I wonder how their children did. So I saw failure as well. I saw cultishness develop. And that played a huge role on who I was. And it was also during this point at the end that I started to discover cinema seriously, also to try to understand where we were. And I've talked about that in other places, so I'll just leave that sit as is for now. Now, the next period is, for me, perhaps the most important period. It is from 1978 to 1980. Only 2 years, but these are the 2 years that kind of set in stone the Bern who is talking to you today. And this is where I left the, shall we say, the womb of the Christian communes, what was then called the Church of the Open Door, went to work in Montana for the summer at a hotel, saved up money, then went to Switzerland and Europe. So I actually went to England for a little bit then, saw actual punks in 1978, saw men in bowler hats still, that was fascinating. The old England was still there, and it was going to die within a few years. It was going to slowly become Americanized, so that I remember years later, so I was like, what happened? But it was here I became really exposed to the ideas of Francis Schaeffer, Hans Ruckmacher, my good friend John Sandry. It was there that I learned more about Calvinism, more about, but also about aesthetics and art and philosophy. I learned more, and I really dug in myself. They were the ones who gave me the permission to go ahead and, it was okay for Christians to just plunge into the world of art and culture and learn. One of the greatest regrets I have is that Ruckmacher died the year before I got there, and I really wanted to talk to him. And that's like one of these things, it's like, okay, one day in heaven or something. I don't know. But it was also at this point that I discovered Europe. And by saying that, I mean, here I was in Europe. I was in two places for about almost a year. And one was across Switzerland, across Lake Geneva, in a little town in France. And we would go back and forth over the border for lectures and such. And the other was in the French part of Switzerland in the mountains at the L'Abri Fellowship. The importance here I can't overestimate. Maybe someday. I've talked about the importance of L'Abri to me in other places, but this just totally re-scrambled my mind. It was also here I completely broke the cult mentality. And I remember the long talk I had with a Jewish Christian professor from the University of Rhode Island, a guy named David Friedman. We walked and talked, and he turned to me at one point and said, it's amazing you've gone through all of that and you got out of it. And that is the thing, is I didn't just throw up my hands and say, all this is too oppressive and such. I just said, no, there's something here that's right, and we're the ones doing something wrong, which is how I ended up in Switzerland to try to redress that wrong. It's also here in that I started noticing fashion magazines in Europe, which were much classier looking than the American species. And that became an important thing to me, the ideas of fashion, photography, and also notions of beauty. It was also here that I really started thinking more during this period, and especially when I came back to America, and I was back in California for about 6 months, but I started going even more to the movie theaters, and so I saw more international cinema, science fiction, horror films, old movies, edgy films like Eraserhead and such, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And it was in watching the Texas Chainsaw Massacre that I came up with this whole notion of American Gothic culture eventually. But it was the decayed aesthetics of that film that really got into me. And it was also here that I committed myself during this period to working on the meaning of rock music history. And again, it's a big question. How did Jimi Hendrix music, why was it so different from everyone else's? I had to answer that question. And I didn't think anyone truly had. And it was also, as a result of these questions, I said, I have to go to where these things are happening. And so I went to New York City, and that's the next period. The next period is a much longer period. It is 1980 to 1996, and I arrived in New York City. I remember the day very clearly. It was I think October 8th, which was John Lennon's birthday. And he was 40 years old, and by the end of the year he would be dead. And there's a whole story related to that of my experiencing that assassination. So New York City became very important to me, and in many ways I was very naive about what I would find. Nevertheless, I spent time working with music So I worked for 4 years at JNR Music World, which was a huge place for music and records and things like that. And then I worked at an independent store called Rocks in Your Head. I also spent many of the last 6 years of my time there buying and selling record collections, as people were saying, oh, we don't need these anymore. And later I go, ha ha ha, because I made so much money off of them, and vinyl records never went away. Everyone was expecting it to. But we won't go into that history. It was also during this point, working with music, I was a tour manager of a very strange kind of punk band for one summer. I worked as a radio DJ at WFMU for a summer. I really started collecting music seriously then, and I got a lot of music for free. People say, wow, it's such a big music collection. I go like, yeah, well, the average cost of the record there is 25 cents, since so many of them were given to me for free, or when I'd buy and sell record collections, just so much just came and went. Also, I had friends among those musicians, and sometimes people with names. And I also started making tape collages at this point, which is one of the things that got me into being a DJ at WFMU. So music was a huge part of my existence in New York City. I can't even begin to get into it all, but that's a very important place. It's also here that I started realizing that comic books were seriously changing. And if music changed a lot in the 1960s, and film changed a lot in the 1970s, in the 1980s, it was comic books' turn. And the reason, of course, is clear. Comic books were much more bound by a certain set of restrictions, and also the idea that they were like for kids. And so, that was the way that worked. It was also in New York City that I started really discovering what we would now probably call geekdom or fandoms, the geek world. And so I worked at this, what at that time was like 3 layers tall, massive emporium of science fiction, comic books, horror, all illustration stuff, all sorts of things, called Forbidden Planet. It still exists now in a much smaller variation on it. But through there, I met all these other people for whom their life circled around these things. So, I won't get into all of that, but that's where I first encountered things like European comic books, anime, manga, just some of the extremes of extreme comic books, all sorts of stuff. But it got me in quite ready for the present time, because I got in on the beginning, so much so that many people who were interested in comic books, fantasy, science fiction, horror, detective fiction, and all of that at that time, now look at the present and go like, what in the world happened? It used to be so good. Now it's totally the opposite of cool, Now it's just boring and repetitious and sadly mainstream. See Disney, see Warner Brothers, etc. Also, I spent several years working in the art world there as an art mover, which may sound like, oh, okay, so you're moving stuff around. But art moving is kind of like the cream of the moving profession. And you get into everything. I was also making my own art at the time, which I haven't really exposed too much of to you. But I got into almost every gallery in town, almost every major museum. Got in to see artists, got in to see at their studios. I have so many memories of these things. Collectors' houses. I remember one guy, we walked in, he says, I just get everyone who delivers anything to sign my book, and he lived on Park Avenue, because he says, Warhol came here once as an art mover, and I never got his signature. And so, but you just do this, and I learned so much also about films, and this is where I started going to movie theaters to watch silent films, watch foreign films, art films, classic films, obscure films, and this is where I discovered the films of Jan Schrankmeyer and the Quay brothers, which then would later derail me off into the world of puppetry. I also took a few more trips to Europe while I was there, although none of those trips specifically, say, focused on puppetry the way they would. But always one of the hallmarks of my trips to Europe was to go back to L'Abri. And I ended up giving lectures there and just kind of following L'Abri through different periods. So that was really important to me. And I met so many people with different viewpoints, so many people from different ethnic backgrounds. And at the same time, I never lost my own sense of identity. I will say in the middle of it, but this was more due to loneliness and isolation, which happens because people are coming and going. So the people I met when I was first in New York wouldn't necessarily be the people I knew at the end, although eventually there was more continuity. But it was there that I started building my library, not physically, but I started collecting the things that would become my library, especially with the records. But also, I was a real book hound as well. But I was never a collector, never trying to get the special editions of things, never trying to get first editions of books. And in fact, I would go through periods of purging out my library on occasion. I remember I decided I can't do these mass market paperbacks anymore, and had a bunch of them that had accumulated since my time in California. So I remember leaving this one apartment, and I pulled out the drawer, and it was in the wall, and I put all of these paperback books of all sorts of types into the back of it on the floor, and then closed it. And I said, I'd love to be there someday when someone pulls out that drawer and then sees all the books underneath it. That would be a wonderful thing. I like doing things like that. What else? I rediscovered 60s music and culture. I rediscovered my own Jesus People roots. And also, during this period, I discovered authors like Jacques Ellul, Walker Percy, Owen Barfield, H.P. Lovecraft, Stephen King, Paul Virilio, Tarkovsky, both his books and his films, Dostoevsky, etc., etc., etc. It was just so important to me. Joe Bob Briggs. And this is where I got my ideas about memory and time. But that's the fourth period of my life up until 1996. And in 1996, I won't go into why I decided to move to Alaska. All of that can be found probably somewhere else. But let's talk about 1996 to 2018. And that is the 22 years that I lived in Alaska. So I moved to Alaska, and I did not have a job when I arrived there. I was hoping to get one at the radio station, and I did. And I worked working at the radio station for basically around 10 years. And I was a producer. What I did was I bluffed my way in. Total bluff. I had taken my tape collages. I had taken basically 3 months as a volunteer at WFMU in New York. I could say this was one of the most important radio stations in the country, which it was. I could take my public speaking and lecture and put it all together, and it looked really good for radio, and in fact it was. So I was a producer, program director, I'm not going to explain what all these are, music director, volunteer trainer, DJ, and I also, as producer and as program director, I also was responsible for the fundraisers, which is, again, links below. Help me out, please. And I learned a lot of techniques about how to do that. Also during this time, that was during the first half of my time in Alaska. The last 12 years was basically doing wildlife tours and taking people on the river. I was a bus driver. I'd take people to meet raft guides who would float down the rivers. But I was outside all the time. My office was a river. Later, it was through doing this. I learned a lot about the wilderness, a lot about rivers, a lot about mountains, a lot about bears, about moose, about eagles, about whales, about salmon. Just a lot about genuine wilderness, and also how to live in it. I always had to have first aid classes. I always had to learn what to do in the event that you're lost, what to do if the weather gets bad, what to do if you fall into the water, these kinds of things. And once I did fall into the water, in a canoe a friend had. I was close to losing my life. But hey, I'm here, so let's not think about that. And so I worked for places like Chilkat Guides or Rainbow Glacier. And it was just like so many life skills. In Alaska, I knew I was going to a place where the kind of intellectual, creative stuff I was doing didn't matter as much to people. What mattered more was the life skills people had. So whether it was, for me, it was about things like creating an inviting home, making a garden, fixing things, the community life. Also, foraging for mushrooms was a huge activity for me. Or other things like berries or spruce tips, which I'd make tea out of. Devil's Club, which was a very strange ginseng-adjacent plant. And making things out of these things. And I learned a lot about death, about water. I learned about death in New York City, too. Criminal death, wrongful death. But here I learned about natural death. I learned that the most dangerous things there were water, all water-based. And that was ice, snow, water, snow on the road. Within the first month I was there, a girl that I saw at the local convenience store skidded off the road and died. And so I learned about these things. I learned also about the native Tlingit culture, Tlingit Indians. And I learned a lot about them. I attended a Presbyterian church off and on for most of the time there. And that was funky. But the people were nice. Sometimes the actual programs they had were, don't get me started. But I brought my mother up there to live, and she lived the last 10 years of her life there. And I experienced her death up close with just her and me in her apartment for the last week. That was an experience. That was a big influence on how the rest of my life would be lived. I also taught homeschool students things about music and film and art, things they would never get any other way. I tried to prepare them for the world. Did I succeed? Don't know. But I tried. Let's see. I also experimented with making small films with imagery and photographs. And my aesthetic sense grew and grew during this period. And it was also, most importantly, this is the time, one of the things I did do was bring musicians up there. So I am proud of the fact that the first full concert of Imogen Heap took place in Alaska because I invited her up there. And Deke Dickerson and Barents Whitfield, and who was the other one? Buckwheat Zydeco were among the people I invited to play up there. So that was interesting. But the puppet stuff was the most important. Now here's the interesting thing. So I took these puppet trips, and I would say these are the following trips that were specifically related to puppets. 2000 was the first, that's the first time I started saying, let me see if there's a puppet theater in this town. And I ended up in Prague and different places. But then the most serious one was 2005. That's where my head just blew up. And then 2012, 2016, 2017, 2018. And so, of course, my whole sense of puppetry grew in Alaska. And, of course, we made puppets there. So we did the Lilliputian Puppet Sideshow from 2008 to 2010. And then Reckoning Motions was my second trip from 2009 to 2018. And this was essentially, I also taught classes. I had different students. Nobody knew anything about puppetry, so it was up to me. So I ended up accumulating a lot of material, which is why I have so much puppet-related material, even here. I keep collecting it because I realized, no one knows much about this, and they should. And it was also during this period that I took a 2-month puppet tour around North America, Canada and North America. I'm going to do something someday on that tour. It was fascinating and really instructive. And I learned that this puppet thing that I was doing really would communicate to people. And we did the thing called the Great Ziggurat Tour. Then on my puppet journeys, I met and interviewed puppeteers. I met people who were legendary. I met young puppeteers. I could list names, but you probably wouldn't know most of these people. This is also when I started my Gravity from Above project, which I'm still working on. I need time. The only way to get time is to get more money. It's just, we'll stop there. But this, I also started my Anadromous Life YouTube channel there, which was mostly a place so that I could put videos on there and then I have a couple of essay sites. One is called The Anadromous Life, and the other is called Gravity from Above, and I could put videos there and then link them to my essays. Later, those would become it would become a site on its own called Gravity from Above. It was also during this time that I started thinking about and discovering the world of ballet and dance in 2011, and my interests continue in that. And it was during this period that I discovered Georgia. 2012 is when I discovered Georgia, and then I started looking for all this music and dance. And then there's this period, 2014, 2015, my mother's death, I've already mentioned, the most important event of my life because it was like so direct. It wasn't mediated. It was the real thing, and it really made me think about a lot about things. And then I lost my house that I was living in. It was sold out from under me. And things came up where I ended up moving to Georgia, which I've talked about in other places why. But let's go to the final period of my life. And again, this is not about my biography. What it's about is the things that have influenced how I've seen things. So, animals, the death of my mother, but also all the practical things I saw in Alaska, the real wilderness that I saw in Alaska that I'd never really seen up until then. But also the discovery of puppetry, the discovery of things like ballet, and the country of Georgia, all of these things, and all these trips to Europe as well. And also I continued working in music. So, the last period of my life. And the last period is, of course, this period, the sixth period of my life. Now, I'm not putting any particular numerological, maybe I'll end at the seventh period. I don't think like that. I'm just saying this is the natural way things broke down. And so it's 2018, although there's a prehistory of that with my first visits to Georgia, but 2018, the end of the year, until the present, and that is the Georgian period where I'm living here. So, what has influenced me here? Well, just living here for one thing. And the mentality of people. I have conversations with people I probably would not have in other places. Georgian music, dancing, culture. I never knew anything about Georgian art before coming here, and now I'm just fascinated by it. And Georgian literature, I never knew much about. I did read Shota Rustaveli's The Knight in Panther Skin, but that was that. Also, I started all my other YouTube channels here through discovering people like Paul Vanderklay, Jonathan Peugeot, Alistair Roberts, and other people. And so I started the Anadromist and Georgian Crossroads, and later Lacrimatorium, and the Anadrome is the newest one. And those have all been very important. I wouldn't be talking to you now had I not started these channels since I was here. And I started the channels here because of how little I realized I was being paid at the job that I thought I was going to do when I arrived here. And then there are explorations in the country, which include both extremely beautiful and amazing natural sites in the mountains and all the different things that you see in nature here, but it also includes the architecture, the culture. And so those things have made a big impression on me. Just my Georgian life has really influenced how I look at things now. And then meeting, like I said, just Georgian friends, Georgian conversations, meeting people from other countries, the expats. And then I went through the whole COVID pandemic here. And also I took a journey to Prague in 2022. and another one to Germany in 2022 as part of the Bridges of Meaning, which kind of connected me more, which then had me, and also in 2022, the whole Russian invasion of Ukraine had a big effect on a lot of things and brought over 100,000 Russians into Tbilisi, and I have friends now who are Russians who are part of that diaspora. And then, of course, I did the gathering in Georgia last year, and I've had people visiting me now. I think, how many people did I have visit me last year? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think about 6 people, not including the guys from the gathering in Georgia, came and visited me. And all of them had an amazing experience. Just a hint, if you ever want to come visit, do come visit. And now I am doing the biggest thing, trying to bring my library from Alaska to Georgia, which is, I think, on a scale of physical tasks in my life, is easily the biggest. I thought the move from New York to Alaska was big, but this is so much more. And you can help, the link below, do help. I only need $1,145 to get to the $12,000 goal. And it would be nice if I didn't have to keep begging for it. But there we are. And on March 6th, I'm going. I have the plane tickets. But the point of this is all of this is to say this. You have influences. What influences you? When you know your influences, for instance, the very fact that New York City, I lived through a couple different phases there. The fact that I understood that, I saw the hippies, then saw the punks. The fact that Alaska was a very different environment, that Georgia is a very different environment, that traveling through Europe to find puppeteers is a very different world. All of these things go into you, and you can't have simplistic left, right, American, European, whatever ideas. You have to engage more with the world. And by knowing what influences you, what books you've read, I didn't even mention the books that I've read since I've been here or what I discovered in Alaska, which was a lot. Although, like I said, a lot of what I discovered in Alaska had to do with ballet, art. I've certainly found more people to read there. But here, I've been discovering more about Georgian art, and I've collected Georgian art books because they're easy to find and some of them are pretty cheap. So that's it. What influences you? List a few things down below. You can, if you want to make a long list, be my guest, or make your own channel and talk about the things that influence you. But what influenced you? What made you what you are? What made you change? What made you grow? Now, I'm not talking about the private, personal, psychological, the relationship stuff, but I am talking about the intellectual and cultural things, the artistic, the creative things, the what goes into who you are. Why do you do what you do? Who are you? We'll leave it there. Thanks for watching. Thank you for all the people who have contributed to the library container epic. And from Georgia, this is Byrne saying thank you so much for being there for me. And we will meet again. Drolabit.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.